Nashville, Tennessee, August 1985. A city where country music filled the air and tourists crowded Broadway, where summer heat shimmered off asphalt and families visited the Grand Ole Opry and Opryland USA theme park on vacation. Katie Sullivan was 7 years old with blonde hair and pigtails, bright blue eyes and a shy smile that appeared when she felt safe. And she carried everywhere a brown teddy bear named Mr. Buttons that her grandmother had given her when she was 3. The Sullivan family lived in Indianapolis, Indiana, and they had driven to Nashville for a week-long vacation, staying at a motel on West End Avenue near Vanderbilt University, and Katie shared a room with her older sister Emma, who was 12. Susan Sullivan, Katie's mother, was a teacher, and Paul Sullivan, her father, worked as an accountant, and they had been planning this trip for months, excited to show their daughters Nashville and teach them about music history and Southern culture. On Thursday, August 15th, the family spent the morning at the Parthenon in Centennial Park, where Katie had been fascinated by the replica of the Greek temple, and she clutched Mr. Buttons while Emma took photographs with her new camera. After lunch, they drove to Opryland, USA, the theme park that would close years later, but in 1985 was Nashville's premier attraction, and Katie was excited about the rides even though she was nervous about the bigger ones. The park was crowded with families enjoying the final weeks of summer vacation, and Susan reminded both girls to stay close, to hold hands, to not wander off, and Katie nodded seriously while hugging Mr. Buttons against her chest. They rode the carousel first because Katie loved horses, and then they went through the Grizzly River Rampage water ride where everyone got soaked and laughed, and Paul bought them cotton candy that turned Katie's tongue blue. Around 3 o'clock, they were walking through the frontier area of the park heading toward the train ride, and Emma stopped to look at a souvenir shop display, and Susan and Paul paused with her, and Katie stood beside them holding Mr. Buttons. When Susan turned around 30 seconds later to check on Katie, her younger daughter was gone, and the spot where she had been standing was empty, and Susan's voice went sharp as she called Katie's name. Paul immediately began searching nearby, looking behind displays and in the shop, while Emma ran to check the bathroom, and Susan stood in the middle of the pathway calling for Katie, her voice growing more desperate with each repetition. Park security was notified within minutes, and guards began searching the area systematically, asking other visitors if they had seen a 7-year-old girl with blonde pigtails wearing a pink t-shirt and carrying a brown teddy bear. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. The park was locked down with all exits monitored, and security guards checked every ride, every restaurant, every bathroom, and announcements were made over the loudspeaker asking Katie Sullivan to come to the nearest information booth where her parents were waiting. Susan and Paul stood at the security office watching monitors showing different areas of the park, searching for any glimpse of Katie's pink shirt or her blonde pigtails, and Emma sat beside them crying and blaming herself for stopping to look at souvenirs. After 2 hours with no sign of Katie, Metro Nashville Police Department was called, and Detective Raymond Cooper arrived to take statements, and he was 52 years old with 30 years of experience, and he had worked missing children cases before. Cooper interviewed the Sullivan family separately, asking when Katie was last seen, what she was wearing, if she had seemed upset or mentioned wanting to leave, and everyone said Katie had been happy and excited, not distressed or trying to run away. He asked about Mr. Buttons, the teddy bear Katie carried, and Susan described it as brown and worn with button eyes and a red ribbon around its neck, and she said Katie never went anywhere without it, had slept with it every night since she was 3. Search dogs were brought in and they were given Katie's clothing from the motel to establish her scent, and they searched the park systematically, but the park was large with thousands of visitors and multiple scents overlapping, making tracking difficult. By nightfall, the search had expanded to include the parking lots and surrounding areas, and police checked nearby businesses and neighborhoods, and Katie's description was broadcast on local news with a phone number for tips. The Sullivan family stayed at the park until security forced them to leave at closing time, and they returned to their motel room where everything reminded them of Katie, her suitcase open on the bed, her clothes folded, her toothbrush in the bathroom. Emma couldn't sleep in the room she had shared with Katie, so she stayed with her parents, and the 3 of them sat awake all night waiting for a phone call, praying Katie would be found safe, unable to comprehend how she had simply vanished in seconds. The investigation continued through the following days, with officers interviewing park employees, checking security footage though cameras were limited in 1985, and reviewing lists of park visitors, but no leads emerged. Katie's teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, was never found, and investigators assumed Katie had been carrying it when she disappeared, that whoever took her had taken the bear as well, and its absence became a distinguishing detail in missing person reports. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them. So if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. The case dominated Nashville news for weeks, and Katie's school photo appeared on missing person posters throughout Tennessee and neighboring states, and the family received hundreds of tips, but none led to finding Katie or understanding what had happened. Paul and Susan remained in Nashville for 3 weeks, refusing to leave without their daughter, staying at the motel and visiting the police station daily for updates. But eventually they had to return to Indianapolis because Paul's employer needed him back. Leaving Nashville felt like abandoning Katie, and Susan cried the entire drive home, and Emma sat in the back seat staring out the window at the landscape passing by, wondering if Katie was somewhere out there watching cars on the highway. Years passed and the Sullivan family remained in Indianapolis, but their lives were forever divided into before and after Katie's disappearance. And Susan kept Katie's bedroom exactly as it had been, with toys on the shelves and books on the nightstand. Paul threw himself into work, taking on extra clients and staying late at the office because being home was too painful, and he and Susan grew distant as they processed their grief differently, their marriage strained by shared trauma and helplessness. Emma struggled through her teenage years carrying guilt that never diminished, and she had been the one looking at souvenirs when Katie disappeared, had been 12 years old and supposed to be watching her little sister, and therapy helped, but did not erase the burden. Detective Cooper retired in 2002 after 47 years in law enforcement, and Katie's case haunted him, the little girl who had vanished from a crowded theme park in broad daylight, and he kept a copy of her file at home, reviewing it periodically. In 2015, Katie's case was assigned to Detective Marcus Hall, who was 38, and specialized in cold cases involving missing children, and he reviewed the file multiple times, studying the witness statements, the security footage, the park layout. Hall noticed something in the original evidence inventory, a notation that several items had been found in the park in the weeks following Katie's disappearance and had been turned in to Lost and Found, but many had never been fully processed for DNA. He requested that all stored items from Opryland USA's 1985 Lost and Found be located, and after searching through archives at the Metro Nashville Police Department and the Tennessee State Museum, which had acquired Opryland materials after the park closed, several boxes were found. Among the items were jackets, hats, toys, cameras, and stuffed animals that had been collected from various locations in the park during August and September 1985, and Hall had everything sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab for DNA analysis. The lab processed each item carefully, and most yielded DNA from multiple people as expected from objects that had been handled by visitors and park employees. But one stuffed animal produced an interesting result that made Hall stop and reread the report. The item was a brown teddy bear with button eyes and a faded red ribbon around its neck, and it had been found in a maintenance area behind the Grizzly River Rampage ride on August 20th, 5 days after Katie disappeared. The bear matched the description of Mr. Buttons that Katie had been carrying, and DNA extracted from the fur and paws belonged to Katie Sullivan based on comparison with family DNA samples that had been collected during the original investigation. But there was also male DNA found on the bear's paws and around the neck area where the ribbon was tied, touch DNA from someone who had grabbed or held the bear, and the pattern suggested forceful handling, not casual contact. Hall ran the unknown male DNA profile through CODIS hoping for a match, and after 2 weeks the system returned a result that made his heart race, a strong match that led to someone completely unexpected and devastating. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. The DNA profile belonged to Walter Jennings, who was now 68 years old, and Hall pulled his file discovering that Jennings had been arrested in 2008 for assault, and his DNA had been entered into the database as part of standard booking procedures. Hall researched Jennings's background and found that in 1985, he had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Opryland, USA, responsible for overseeing repairs and upkeep throughout the park, and he had been employed there from 1982 until the park closed in 1997. Jennings had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation as part of the routine questioning of all park employees, and he had told Detective Cooper that he had not seen Katie Sullivan or noticed anything unusual that day, and with no evidence to contradict him, he had been cleared. But now, 38 years later, Jennings' DNA was on Katie's teddy bear in a pattern that suggested he had grabbed or handled it forcefully, and the bear had been found in a maintenance area where Jennings would have had access, and Hall knew this was significant. Hall began investigating Jennings's history more thoroughly, and he discovered that Jennings had left Opryland in 1997 when the park closed and had worked at various maintenance jobs around Nashville, and he had been fired from 2 positions following complaints about his behavior. In 2003, a parent at an elementary school where Jennings worked as a janitor had complained about him spending too much time near the playground watching children, and while no formal charges were filed, he had been quietly let go. The 2008 assault arrest involved Jennings grabbing a teenage girl's arm at a shopping mall and trying to convince her to come with him to help find a lost dog, and mall security had intervened, and he had been charged with misdemeanor assault. Hall had enough for a warrant to bring Jennings in for questioning, and he obtained one along with authorization to search Jennings's current residence, and on a cold morning in November 2023, he and 3 other officers drove to Jennings's address in Antioch. Jennings lived in a rundown duplex, and when Hall knocked on the door, Jennings answered wearing stained clothes and looking older than his years, and his expression shifted when Hall showed his badge and said he needed to talk about Katie Sullivan from Opryland in 1985. Jennings hesitated, then said he did not remember anyone by that name, but Hall said they had found Katie's teddy bear with Jennings's DNA on it, and Jennings's face went pale and he asked if he needed a lawyer. Hall said that was his right, but they were going to search his home regardless, and Jennings stepped aside, allowing the officers in, and the duplex was cluttered with old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and boxes of belongings accumulated over decades. Officers searched methodically through every room, every closet, every drawer, and in the back bedroom they found boxes of photographs, hundreds of images taken at Opryland during the 1980s and 90s, many showing children on rides or walking through the park. Among the photographs were several showing Katie Sullivan at the park on the day she disappeared, images of her riding the carousel, eating cotton candy with her family, walking through the frontier area, and it was clear Jennings had been following her and photographing her before she vanished. Hall confronted Jennings with the photographs, asking why he had been taking pictures of Katie, why his DNA was on her teddy bear, and where Katie was now, and Jennings sat silent for several minutes before saying he wanted to make a statement. Hall transported Jennings to the Metro Nashville Police Department and placed him in an interrogation room, and after reading him his rights and confirming he was waiving his right to an attorney, Hall activated the recording equipment and asked Jennings to tell the truth about Katie Sullivan. Jennings said he had been working at Opryland that day in August 1985, and he had noticed Katie with her family because she was carrying the teddy bear and looked sweet and innocent, and he had followed them through the park taking photographs. He said when the family stopped in the frontier area near the souvenir shops, he saw an opportunity, and he approached Katie from behind while her parents and sister were distracted, and he told her he had found a lost puppy that needed help. Katie had looked uncertain, but Jennings said the puppy was scared and needed a kind person to help, and he held out his hand, and Katie had taken it still holding her teddy bear, and he had led her away from her family toward the maintenance areas. He said he took her through employee-only doors to the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the park, areas where visitors never went, and Katie had started crying and asking for her mother, and Jennings had taken the teddy bear from her to keep her quiet. He said he had planned to keep Katie for a while, had fantasized about having a daughter, but Katie had struggled and screamed, despite his attempts to calm her, and in his panic he had put his hand over her mouth to silence her. He said he had not meant to hurt her, had only wanted her to stop screaming, but Katie had fought and he had pressed too hard, and by the time he realized what was happening, she had stopped moving. And he checked, but she was not breathing. Jennings said he had carried Katie's body deeper into the tunnels, to a storage area that was rarely accessed, and he had hidden her there while he figured out what to do, and he had thrown the teddy bear into a trash bin near the Grizzly River rampage. The teddy bear had apparently been found by maintenance staff cleaning the area and had been turned into lost and found, but Jennings had not known that, had assumed it was gone, and he had gone back to work pretending nothing had happened. He said Katie's body had remained in the storage tunnel for several days while police searched the park above, and then when the search moved to other areas, he had removed her body at night and buried her in a wooded area near Percy Warner Park. Hall asked for the exact location, and Jennings described a spot near the hiking trails approximately 200 yards from the main path, near a creek bed, and he said he had covered the grave with leaves and branches, and no one had ever found it. Hall organized a search team immediately, and they deployed to Percy Warner Park with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and forensic specialists, and the area Jennings described was dense forest that had grown thick over 38 years. The dogs alerted to a spot near the creek, and the team began excavating carefully, removing layers of soil and decomposed vegetation, and 3 feet down, they found fabric remnants and bones, small and fragile, a child's skeleton. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office, and forensic analysis confirmed through dental records that they belonged to Katie Sullivan, and she had been there for 38 years, buried in the woods, while her family searched and hoped and grieved. Detective Hall called Susan and Paul Sullivan, who were now in their 70s and still living in Indianapolis, and he told them Katie had been found, told them she was coming home after 38 years, and Susan made a sound that was wordless grief and relief combined. Paul asked if she had suffered, and Hall said based on Jennings's confession it had been quick, that Katie had not been held captive for long, and while that provided little comfort, it was something, and he said Jennings was in custody and would face murder charges. Emma flew to Nashville from where she was living in Chicago, and she was now 50 years old, a psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, and she had spent her entire adult life trying to understand and heal from the guilt of losing her sister. The 3 of them sat together in a hotel room in Nashville, the same city where they had lost Katie, and they cried together for the first time in years, finally able to grieve properly, knowing the truth, knowing Katie was no longer lost. The funeral was held in December 2023, 38 years after Katie disappeared, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Indianapolis, where the Sullivan family had attended when Katie was alive, and the sanctuary was full of people who had never stopped remembering. The casket was small and white, covered in sunflowers because yellow had been Katie's favorite color, and inside the casket beside Katie's remains was Mr. Buttons, the teddy bear that had preserved the DNA evidence that solved her case, reunited with her in death. Susan sat in the front pew holding Paul's hand, and she thought about the last moment she had seen Katie alive, standing beside them in Opryland holding Mr. Buttons, and she thought about the 38 years of not knowing, of hoping Katie was alive somewhere. Father O'Brien spoke about faith and loss and the mystery of why God allows children to suffer, and he acknowledged that no words could ease the pain of what the Sullivan family had endured, but he hoped they could find some peace in finally having answers. After the service, they drove to Crown Hill Cemetery, where a plot had been prepared on a hillside with a view of the city, and the headstone was white marble with Katie's name, her dates, and the inscription, "Forever 7, beloved daughter and sister, home at last." Paul placed Katie's favorite book beside the grave, a copy of Where the Wild Things Are that she had asked him to read every night, and Emma placed a photograph of the 2 sisters taken the summer before Katie disappeared, both smiling and happy. Walter Jennings was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence, and his public defender reviewed the evidence including the confession, the DNA on the teddy bear, and the photographs of Katie, and he advised Jennings that a trial would likely result in conviction. In January 2024, Jennings entered a guilty plea to all charges, saying he did not want to put the Sullivan family through a trial, and the courtroom was packed for sentencing with Susan, Paul, and Emma sitting in the front row. Jennings stood before the judge looking diminished and old, and when asked if he had anything to say, he turned toward the Sullivan family and said he was sorry, that he had thought about Katie every day for 38 years, but his apology meant nothing to them. The judge sentenced Jennings to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he was led away in handcuffs. And the Sullivan family walked out of the courthouse knowing justice had been served, but understanding it could not bring back the years they had lost. The days after sentencing were difficult as the finality of Katie's death settled over the family, and for 38 years they had lived with the possibility, however remote, that Katie might still be alive. And now that possibility was gone forever, replaced with certainty and grief. Susan returned to Indianapolis but found it hard to resume normal life, and she visited Katie's grave at Crown Hill Cemetery weekly, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby talking to her daughter about everything she had missed, all the years that had been stolen. Paul struggled with anger he had suppressed for decades, rage at Jennings for taking Katie, at Opryland for not having better security, at himself for looking away for 30 seconds, and he worked through these feelings with a therapist who helped him understand he bore no responsibility. Emma felt a complicated mix of relief and renewed guilt. Relief that Katie had been found and Jennings caught, but also guilt that she had survived and built a life while Katie had died at 7, and therapy helped her process these conflicting emotions. The teddy bear that solved Katie's case remained in evidence storage at the Metro Nashville Police Department, and Detective Hall arranged for it to be properly preserved and displayed as a teaching tool about the importance of processing all evidence, even items that seemed insignificant. The case attracted national attention because of the unusual evidence, a stuffed animal that had preserved DNA for 38 years, and forensic scientists studied how the fabric had maintained genetic material despite being stored in less than ideal conditions for decades. Researchers discovered that the dense synthetic fur of Mr. Buttons had protected the DNA from degradation, and their findings led to improved methods for extracting DNA from fabric evidence, particularly from children's toys and stuffed animals, which often contained touch DNA from multiple individuals. Detective Hall continued working cold cases, and Katie's case became his most significant achievement, demonstrating that even items from lost and found boxes could become crucial evidence decades later if properly preserved and tested with advancing technology. Opryland, USA had closed in 1997, 15 years before Katie's case was solved, but the property had been redeveloped into Opry Mills Shopping Mall, and the owners agreed to install a memorial plaque honoring Katie and reminding visitors about child safety. The plaque was placed near the location where the old Grizzly River Rampage ride had been, and it included Katie's photograph, a brief description of what had happened, and information about recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior around children in public spaces. Susan and Paul established the Katie Sullivan Child Safety Foundation in 2024, providing funding for improved security measures at theme parks and public attractions, including better camera coverage, enhanced training for employees about recognizing child abduction attempts, and protocols for immediate lockdown when children were reported missing. The foundation also funded research into rapid response systems for missing children in crowded venues, and by 2026, they had helped implement new safety measures at over 100 theme parks and attractions across the United States. Emma used her expertise as a psychologist to develop resources for families of missing children, creating support groups and counseling programs specifically designed for the unique trauma of not knowing what happened to a loved one. And she spoke at conferences about her experience as Katie's sister. She emphasized that siblings of missing children often carried guilt and needed specialized support, that their grief was complicated by having survived while their brother or sister did not, and that healing required acknowledging these feelings rather than suppressing them. Walter Jennings remained in prison at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, and he did not appeal his sentence, did not request any hearings, and he worked in the prison laundry, keeping to himself and avoiding interaction with other inmates who knew what he had done. The years moved forward and Katie's story became part of the larger conversation about theme park safety, and her case was studied in security management courses teaching students about vulnerable points in public venues and the importance of immediate response when children went missing. The photographs Jennings had taken of Katie at Opryland were used in training materials for security personnel, demonstrating how predators stalked victims in crowded places, how they observed families to identify moments of distraction, and how quickly abduction could occur even with parents nearby. Theme parks across the country implemented new protocols inspired by Katie's case, including mandatory check-in systems for children, wristbands with parent contact information, designated meeting points clearly marked throughout parks, and staff trained to recognize predatory behavior patterns. These changes came too late for Katie, but protected countless other children who visited attractions with their families, and park security directors credited the Katie Sullivan Foundation with providing the research and funding that made comprehensive safety improvements possible. Detective Marcus Hall retired in 2035 after 23 years with the Metro Nashville Police Department, and he had solved 51 cold cases during his career. But Katie's case remained the one that affected him most deeply because of the teddy bear. He visited Katie's grave before his retirement, bringing yellow flowers and standing there thinking about the 7-year-old girl who had carried Mr. Buttons everywhere, who had trusted an adult who claimed to need help, who had disappeared in seconds while her family looked away. He thought about the teddy bear that had been thrown away but rescued by maintenance staff and turned into lost and found, about how that simple act of not throwing away a child's toy had preserved the evidence that eventually solved the case 38 years later. The science that solved Katie's case continued to evolve, and forensic labs developed specialized techniques for extracting DNA from stuffed animals, dolls, and other children's toys, recognizing that these items often held crucial evidence because children handled them constantly, and predators touched them during crimes. In Michigan, a case from 1992 was solved when DNA was extracted from a doll found at a crime scene, and the profile matched a suspect who had been interviewed and cleared decades earlier, and another family received answers after 31 years. In Florida, a case from 1988 was solved when investigators retested a stuffed rabbit that had belonged to a missing child, and DNA on the toy led to an arrest, and the investigator credited Katie's teddy bear with inspiring them to re-examine toy evidence. Susan Sullivan's health declined in 2037 with heart problems and diabetes, and she spent more time at home, but she continued to oversee the Katie Sullivan Foundation remotely, ensuring the work continued even as her strength diminished. Paul died in 2039 from complications of pneumonia. He was 81 years old, and Susan knew his heart had been broken since 1985, that losing Katie had damaged something fundamental in him that never healed despite decades of trying. He was buried beside Katie at Crown Hill Cemetery, and Susan stood at the graves of her daughter and her husband, and she felt the weight of being the last parent standing, the keeper of memories that would die with her unless preserved for future generations. Emma moved back to Indianapolis to be with her mother, and she helped Susan write a memoir about Katie's life and disappearance, and the decades of waiting for answers, and the book was published in 2040, titled Mr. Buttons Remembers, A Sister's Story. The memoir focused not on the horror of Katie's death, but on who Katie had been, on her personality and quirks and dreams, on the family's journey through grief and uncertainty, and on the importance of never giving up hope that answers would come. Susan died peacefully in her sleep in March 2041 at the age of 83, 56 years after Katie disappeared, and she was buried beside Paul and Katie, and the 3 headstones formed a family reunited in death after decades of separation. Emma stood at the graves after everyone left, looking at the names of her sister, her father, and her mother, and she thought about how one August afternoon in Nashville had shattered their family and shaped everything that came after, defining their entire lives. Emma continued the work of the Katie Sullivan Child Safety Foundation, expanding its mission to include support for families of missing children and funding for cold case DNA testing. And by 2045, the foundation had helped solve 12 additional cases through grants for forensic analysis. She spoke regularly at conferences about her experience losing Katie, about the 38 years of not knowing, about the moment Detective Hall called to say Katie had been found, and about how the teddy bear had preserved the evidence that brought justice and closure. Audiences were moved by her honesty about the guilt she had carried, about how she had been 12 and looking at souvenirs when Katie disappeared, about how therapy and time had helped her understand she was not responsible, but the feelings never fully disappeared. She emphasized that families of missing children needed specialized support, that traditional grief counseling did not address the unique trauma of ambiguous loss, and that organizations should provide resources specifically designed for people living with uncertainty about loved ones. The teddy bear Mr. Buttons was eventually loaned to the Smithsonian Institution for a traveling exhibit about forensic breakthroughs in cold cases, and millions of visitors saw the worn brown bear with button eyes and learned about how it had solved Katie's case. The exhibit included Katie's photograph, information about her disappearance, details about how DNA had been extracted from the fur, and the impact her case had on theme park safety and toy evidence processing, and many visitors left determined to support cold case investigation. Walter Jennings died in prison in September 2046 from heart failure. He was 89 years old, and there was no funeral, no service, no public acknowledgement beyond a notation in prison records that he had died and been cremated. His ashes were disposed of according to state protocol, and the world moved on without marking his passing, and his name faded except as the maintenance worker who killed Katie Sullivan, and the contrast between how Katie was remembered and how he was forgotten seemed appropriate to everyone. The Katie Sullivan Child Safety Foundation continued operating into the 2050s, and Emma's children took over leadership roles, ensuring their aunt's legacy continued protecting children through improved safety measures, enhanced training, and support for families experiencing the trauma of missing loved ones. Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis became a place of pilgrimage for families affected by missing children cases, and people would visit Katie's grave to leave flowers and teddy bears, and the groundskeepers maintained the area carefully, understanding its significance to the broader community. The memorial at Opry Mills, where Opryland had once stood, was updated in 2050 to include information about the Katie Sullivan Foundation and QR codes linking to safety resources, and thousands of shoppers saw it annually, many stopping to read Katie's story. Detective Marcus Hall died in 2052 at the age of 75, and his obituary highlighted his distinguished career solving cold cases, and particularly his work on Katie Sullivan's case, noting that his persistence had brought closure after 38 years. Emma attended his funeral and spoke about how Hall had given her family the gift of truth, how he had thought to test items from old lost and found boxes, how he had refused to accept that Katie's case was unsolvable, and how his dedication had finally brought her sister home. The science of DNA extraction continued advancing, and by 2055, forensic scientists could extract usable profiles from items that had been stored for 60 or 70 years, and cold cases from the 1950s and 60s were being solved using techniques inspired by cases like Katie's. Each breakthrough honored the families who had preserved belongings and evidence for decades, who had kept clothing and toys and personal items, hoping someday technology would reveal their secrets, and each solved case proved that patience could bring justice regardless of how much time passed. Emma lived to see the foundation celebrate 40 years of operation in 2064, and by then, it had helped implement safety measures at over 500 venues, had funded DNA testing that solved 63 cold cases, and had provided support to thousands of families. She died peacefully in 2066 at the age of 81, and she was buried at Crown Hill Cemetery beside Susan, Paul, and Katie, and her headstone read, "Devoted sister, tireless advocate, guardian of Katie's memory," and visitors left teddy bears on all 4 graves. The Katie Sullivan Child Safety Foundation continued operating under new leadership, and Emma's children honored their mother's commitment by expanding the foundation's work internationally, partnering with theme parks and attractions in Europe, Asia, and South America to implement comprehensive child protection protocols. The foundation created a global database of best practices for child safety in public venues, and security professionals from around the world contributed research and strategies, and Katie's story was told in multiple languages, inspiring protective measures that saved countless children from potential harm. The teddy bear Mr. Buttons was returned to the Sullivan family in 2067 after completing its tour of museums and educational institutions, and it was placed in a memorial display at the foundation's headquarters in Indianapolis, preserved in a climate-controlled case. Visitors to the foundation could see Mr. Buttons and learn about Katie's story, about the 38 years the teddy bear had waited to speak, about the DNA that had survived on synthetic fur, and about how one piece of evidence had changed everything for a grieving family. The display included photographs of Katie holding Mr. Buttons, images from the family vacation to Nashville, and documentation of how the case had been solved, emphasizing that preserving evidence and advancing technology could bring justice even when decades had passed. Nashville erected a permanent memorial for Katie in 2070 at Percy Warner Park, where her remains had been found, and the memorial included a bronze sculpture of a little girl holding a teddy bear, looking peaceful and safe. Finally home. The sculpture was placed near the hiking trails, and a plaque told Katie's story and reminded visitors about the importance of child safety, about watching children carefully in public places, about trusting instincts when something felt wrong, and about reporting suspicious behavior immediately. The memorial became a place where families brought their children to teach them about safety, while honoring Katie's memory, and teddy bears were often left at the base of the sculpture, creating a colorful tribute that park staff maintained respectfully. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. Because families deserve answers, and evidence deserves to be heard no matter how many years pass or how carefully secrets are hidden. Katie Sullivan was 7 years old when she disappeared from Opryland, USA. She loved her teddy bear Mr. Buttons and carried him everywhere. She had blonde pigtails and a shy smile. And though her future was stolen by someone who worked at the park she trusted, her voice endured. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a catalyst for protecting children in public venues, as proof that stuffed animals can preserve DNA for decades, as inspiration for testing items from lost and found boxes, and as a legacy that changed how theme parks protect the children who visit them. Her teddy bear captured more than her abductor's DNA. It captured a moment of trust betrayed and innocence destroyed, and that bear waited 38 years in storage until someone thought to test it. And in the end, the truth emerged as it always does, patient and persistent, waiting in synthetic fur and button eyes for someone to look closely enough to find it. And justice came not quickly but certainly, bringing Katie home and ensuring her story would protect children for generations, proving that evidence never stops speaking. It simply waits for someone willing to listen. The legacy of Mr. Buttons lived on through every child protected by enhanced security measures, through every cold case solved by testing toy evidence, through every family that received answers after years of waiting, and through the foundation that bore Katie's name and continued fighting to keep children safe. Katie's story became eternal not through the horror of her death, but through the hope her case provided to other families, through the safety measures that prevented similar tragedies, through the science that advanced because of her teddy bear, and through the love that never stopped even after 38 years of silence, proving that some bonds cannot be broken by time or death or distance, and that truth will always find its way home.